Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another special episode of the Prof Talks, where instead of Greg asking the questions, we are putting our questions, your questions, to the Prof himself, put him in on the spot, adding a little bit of an extra challenge. So today we're talking about how to achieve the impossible. Now, for anyone who's familiar with Greg, you'll be very familiar with the work he's done with a number of charity challenges, charity celebrity challenges, where he's taken people who would probably think they're not particularly fit, and they've done some incredible things, all in the name of charity. But not only that, Greg has decided on his own back to do some pretty incredible challenges for himself. So Greg, big question for you. How do we achieve the impossible?
Oh, that's a hell of an intro, by the way. I mean, I think it's interesting. Do you know what? Nelson Mandela coined it beautifully, and that was that it's only impossible until it's been achieved. And I think it's absolutely true. Is I think that sometimes what we do is we coin things. You know, we love to coin things. Oh, it's impossible. That'll never happen. There's no way you can do that. And I think actually one of the key factors for us as individuals is that invariably it's the people around us who reinforce that. We think about, oh, sure, you know, I'm thinking about doing that particular event or that particular race or that particular challenge. And obviously, as an individual, personally, you are stretching yourself and you're pushing yourself. And at the back of that, you're sometimes thinking to yourself, is it possible? Can I do this? And then, of course, if you've got people around you, then layer on top of that the idea that, oh, it's impossible, you'll never be able to do it. What they do is that reinforces that idea. And so invariably, most great challenges are lost at the first hurdle, which is actually entering, you know, committing to actually doing them. So I think to some extent, you know, achieving the impossible is actually about taking that first step. I think, and that's the most important step, is actually committing to taking on the challenge. And then obviously being successful in that challenge is something slightly different, in the sense that requires a whole host of, you know, all this stuff that we'll talk about, I'm sure, but things like planning and teamwork and all of those type of things. But I think generally, I think, you know, if somebody tells you it's impossible, then I always look at that and think, do you know what? In that case, it's the right challenge to take on.
Yeah.
Because it means that people will respect it. And so I to some extent, I turn that around and think, you know what? It's a positive. If people turn around and say it's easy, well, yeah, you think, what's the point? What's the point of doing it? You know, so yeah. So I think, you know, and it's the use of that word impossible. I think, you know, the bottom line is that if it was impossible by definition, you absolutely would never be able to do it. I think that what it is that invariably what we do is we coin things as impossible, when actually they're only impossible until they've been achieved.
Yeah. And when we talk about this idea of a challenge or a high performance, this appears very differently for very different people. And is that first step going to be then different for those different people? 100%.
I mean, it's a very personal thing, a challenge. And I think, you know, it's always you have to be very, very difficult, because I think that, you know, to some extent that there are, I mean, it sort of comes in three areas, really. One is this idea that somehow what we've got to try and do is achieve what elite athletes, full-time professional athletes achieve. Well, that simply is not the case, you know. I mean, it depends on, we're just chatting about this, that age, you know, how old you are. I think almost treble your age. So, you know,
I wouldn't do yourself a disservice. It's about double. It's about double. You're doing okay.
This morning it feels like that. But, you know, I mean, so, you know, there are clear sort of limitations, particularly in terms of things like time. I think distance is something very different to that. But certainly in terms of things like power output, and so therefore speed and therefore time, I think does change with things like age and obviously gender and a whole host of other factors. But I think you know, so I think what's and obviously what's crucial is your own personal background. Where have you come from? What have you done thus far? And I think, you know, I always sort of coin the New Year's resolutions in this area, because invariably, I mean, the vast majority of New Year's resolutions go no further than 21 days. The average period of time to give up on a New Year's resolution is 21 days. And I think much of that is actually based around the planning. It's about the goal itself, you know, that you're selecting a goal, and then having selected that goal, the way that you structure how you're going to achieve that goal around it is where the failure occurs. It's actually not you, it's actually just the planning that goes into it. So I think, you know, if you've never run before, then your first goal shouldn't be a marathon, albeit the sort of public perception would be, if you're a runner, you've got to run a marathon. That's the only thing that counts. Well, it's absolutely untrue. I mean, I work, in fact, we just recently published last week some of my best work, I think, on exercise and cancer. And I've done a lot of work in cancer and cancer prehab and rehab in recent years. And one of the things that we often use for rehab cancer patients is the 5K. So we gradually return them back to 5K. Now, let me tell you, once you have gone through chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgery, a 5K is, I mean, it's an ultra marathon, you know, in terms of what you are looking to achieve, that pinnacle. So I think it's very much about making sure that you select a challenge which is, and other factors with it, but make sure that it is achievable, albeit it might take a huge amount of work and planning and commitment and motivation, but it should be achievable. But I think the one thing that underpins all of it is actually choose something that matters to you. I think I've spoken to so many people, so many clients over the years who've said, oh yeah, I want to run a marathon. And my first question to them is, do you like running? And I would say in a good half of cases, they say, do you know what? I hate running. It's like, well, why you're only doing a marathon because that's what people recognize, you know, when you go down the pub for a pint. You know, think about a challenge that matters to you. And in doing that, you're much more likely to be successful.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's about sort of looking back at what you've potentially already achieved or what you've not achieved, and then finding what's going to add most value to that journey in the future. And that kind of informs the way we're able to then motivate ourselves to undertake that challenge. Do you agree with that?
100%. And I think it is, and what you coined there is something that I speak an awful lot about, and that is this idea that I think a lot of people think motivation is intrinsic, that you're a motivated person or you're not a motivated person. When actually motivation is created. The structure, you know, the goal that you set, the structure of the training that you place around it, all of that then drives the commitment that is required to deliver success. And then with the right structure, you've got these short-term goals. As you reach those short-term goals, all of a sudden you start to see success. And of course, that success then drives motivation. So it's self-generated with the right approach. And I think that's the key to remember it. And of course, if you are taking on a challenge that at least at the start, listen, you know, some of the big challenges I do, if you ask me if I'm enjoying it halfway through, the answer is probably going to be no. But I think the point is that it has to be something that really does matter to you. There has to be a reason for it. I often call it the central motivator. And there are different ways of structuring that. It doesn't have to necessarily be the challenge itself. So the modality of the exercise, whether it's swimming, running, triathlon. But I think there has to be a reason to be doing it. And that, you know, for me, the great thing is charity is a wonderful central motivator, is that you are doing it for a very good reason, that to improve the lives of people much less fortunate than yourself. And there's, to my mind, there's nothing more powerful than that. But having that structured within those goals does move that impossible into the possible.
Yeah, and I just want to very quickly sort of touch on those sort of charity challenges, because what a lot of people might not realize is you haven't just been the coach, for example, or the advisor for these people undertaking the challenges. More often than not, you've been doing it side by side with them the whole time, which is incredible in of itself. So do you want to sort of just touch on a few of those experiences, what it was like for you to continue to inspire and motivate these people to do these challenges, whilst you yourself potentially are suffering just as much alongside them?
Suffering more sometimes, I tell you.
Oh, okay. Suffering more.
I mean, it's an interesting one. You know, I mean, my job. You know, the interesting thing, you know, my job is one of two things on the big sort of charity challenges that I've worked on 36 of them now. I always say there's two things that my job is on those. Number one is to get from point A to point B to the finish. There is no success until you pass the finish lines. But if it's a 5-day challenge, there's no success in getting to day 2. If you're climbing Kilimanjaro, there's no success getting to 4,000 meters and then not making summit day. You know, so it is about getting to the end. But then I think crucially on top of that, and incredibly importantly on top of that, is to do that safely. And my job is to make sure that they remain safe throughout that. And the charity challenge are always the interesting ones, I think, because there are lots of things that I can create for people in that sort of training process and the structure and all those things we've just spoken about. But the one thing that's very difficult, one thing you can't do is give people experience. And experience is so very important for a whole host of different things. Very simply for things like pace judgment. How quick do I go? What do we do on day one? It's a 5-day challenge. How quick do we go on day one? Well, making sure that we're at the right pace on day one is crucial to how day 5 looks, if it looks possible at all. And then it's things like hydration and nutrition, making sure that you're on top of that on a continual basis, make sure you're refueling. The experience of recovery post-exercise, post, if it's a multi-day challenge, post-day recovery, optimizing that in preparation for the following day. And I think also just an experience. I think one of the key experiences, we've touched on this a number of times, but every great challenge has its misery. The challenge is often in here, where it just does become really arduous and really tough. And actually, if it was easy, it wouldn't be worth achieving anyway. So it is difficult, but actually managing that takes experience. If you've done it before and you've been there before, you sort of know, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Whereas I'm sure all of us, anybody that listens to this has done just a piece of exercise before, and you get halfway through and you think, how am I going to get the second half? How am I going to keep going? And that's where the experience comes. But sort of going to your other point about doing it with them, it can be brutal. Particularly things like cold open water. Because the critical thing about swimming cold open water is making sure you generate heat, because you're losing it. Cold water, for example, is 25 times more conductive than air. So what that means is it strips heat off you so rapidly. So obviously there are multiple ways that you can try and combat that. One is at the output end. So you can increase subcutaneous fat, so just get a little bit larger. You can wear equipment, so things like wetsuits, neoprene caps, gloves, booties, etc. But at the other end of the spectrum, what you can do is just swim faster. And if you generate more heat, you can maintain core body temperature a little bit better. But the problem is that when I'm swimming alongside these guys, invariably they're swimming, a quarter, 20%, 15% of my maximum pace. And so therefore I'm not generating any heat at all. So whilst they are actually working really hard and actually generating the heat that's required to maintain it, effectively what I'm doing is just constantly cooling and cooling and cooling. And it does become a particular, I remember some training sessions me and David Walliams did in some just brutal conditions. I remember we met in December up in Newcastle. We had a 2-hour swim in the North Sea, and it was when we got in the water, we actually cracked the ice on the beach. Obviously the sea's not iced over because it's saline, but it was, and in those environments, it is a fight, a mental internal fight to keep going. So it's really interesting, and to some extent I guess that's why I love it, because it really is. It's not a challenge for me going at that pace, but it is a challenge physiologically going at that pace. And so therefore there is a real challenge built into it.
I think what's probably true in those sort of situations is when you're doing these challenges, say with David Walliams, when you're swimming the Channel and the Thames, for example, your experience and your suffering alongside him was probably quite motivating for him, knowing, do you know what, it's just as hard for Greg as it is for me. So you sort of collectively in that sort of team environment can kind of achieve it together. And would that sort of be true for less experienced people who are looking to take on a challenge? Find a group of people to do it with who are more experienced or who you trust, and you can kind of go through that journey together. Take those first steps and those success story steps along the way together.
Yeah, 2 different points there. I think that the interesting one is that on the first point about whoever I'm working with, I think that one people say to me, how fit do I have to be to work with these guys? I would say that probably I have to be 10-fold fitter. My job is not to look tired, because if I'm looking tired, we're all in trouble, and I think actually that reflects really heavily on the guys that I'm working with, because what they're expecting is from I'm supporting them. I don't require any support from them in order to keep doing what I'm doing. And so actually, I think from that perspective, I think it's actually really important that that when I'm helping them constantly. My job is to support them on a continual basis. So therefore, I certainly shouldn't outwardly be showing any struggle whatsoever, which hopefully I never do. I think that you picked up on a really interesting word. So I think anybody who's thinking about doing this, I think that actually having somebody with that experience as part of their team is really valuable. But the word that you use, I think, is the word that has, I would say, that personifies the 36 challenges that I have ever done from a sort of high profile celebrity challenge perspective. And that is trust. Is that what all of the challenges do is that they trust me implicitly to make sure that number one, I'm going to get them to the finish line. And also, and most crucially, is I'm going to keep them safe in doing that. So I think, anybody taking on a big challenge, I think there is a real value in having somebody who has got experience of doing, it doesn't have to be that challenge, but similar challenges, that type of challenge can be really valuable. But in choosing that individual, you have to make sure that you trust them implicitly. And that relationship sort of works both ways, but it's really very, very important in terms of delivering success.
Yeah, I'm really glad you agree with that, and sort of finding that trust in another person so they can help you identify what those little points of success look like. Because success along those journeys doesn't have to be going from zero to marathon. The little successes in the middle that inform your motivation and keep you going and pushing to that next level could be simply just going for one run a week. And that could be to the end of the street and back to your front door again. And so it's just about finding someone who can help you recognize that and maybe even do it with you, just like you were sort of taking on challenges with your celebrity counterparts.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
if I'm going to draw
what your point there, so I just say what you're pointing there to is goal setting, and I think that's why goal setting is integral to success. I mean, it's absolutely crucial, and I think that progressive approach. I mean, obviously, you can read about it in one of my books, but the way that you structure goals is really important to make that they're timely and they're achievable and all of these things. But I think actually making sure that you've got those short-term goals set so that actually there is a really nice, obvious and achievable progression through it is absolutely crucial to success.
Yeah, completely agree. And just to sort of bring back a little bit, which celebrity challenge? Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Which one was the hardest? The hardest for you and for the celebrity or celebrities involved if it was a group challenge?
Wow. God, it's an interesting question, really, because the one thing I love about the challenges that we've done is that they are proper challenges. They're not. This is not TV manufactured challenge, and let's make it look really hard here, and we'll inject some fake jeopardy to make it look like they're really hurting. What you see is what you get, and they are all brutal, and to some extent that they are sort of designed around the challenger. So you think someone like Jo Brand, what a legend Jo was. She walked from Hull to Liverpool, which was actually about this time of year, because most of them were at this time of year, and the storms that we're getting today were actually similar to the storms that we had in those days. We went over the highest point in England, and we watched a juggernaut being blown off the road. The winds were that strong, and for her, that was a massive challenge. So these challenges are very personal, but I think for me, my personal perspective, I think probably the toughest challenge was David Walliams swimming the Thames.
So I just want to draw on one of the challenges that stood out to me the most, and that's probably swimming the Thames, because most people look at the Thames and go, it's not nice even on a boat, let alone getting in it and swimming from end to end. So what on earth drove you all to decide that this was going to be the challenge, and why did you choose to get involved?
I think the interesting thing about these challenges is that as we started our conversation, it is about what is impossible. And you sort of look swimming the length of the Thames. I mean, the Thames itself in total length is 205 miles, but you're not allowed to swim for the vast majority of what they call the tidal Thames. So the Thames is split into two. One is the upper Thames, which is governed by the Environment Agency, and then you've got the tidal Thames, which is from Teddington Lock out to the sea, which is the Port of London Authority. And so we couldn't swim the whole distance. So we chose 140-mile length of it, starting at the navigable, what's called the navigable Thames. So basically where boats can start. It's deep enough to swim at Lechlade, and then through. So, firstly, it sounds impossible. And that was 20 miles a day for 7 consecutive days. So, I mean, it's swimming the channel every day for 7 consecutive days. It is iconic, which I think is really important, that people can immediately think about the Thames. The irony of it tells you it's going to be really, really tough. And then I think because of both of those things, actually, it means that the most important thing about these challenges is that you can raise an awful lot of money for people less fortunate than ourselves, and so that was really what sort of drove it. But it was a war of attrition. I mean, it is something else. I mean, it is the Upper Thames to some extent. Well, the Upper Thames is actually relatively clean. I mean, we've got now problems with sewage being pumped into it on a regular basis and those sort of things, which bring some pretty poor headlines to the water quality. But it's a really interesting route. I think the one thing that I found about the route, swimming it, is that there's really very few people that you see as you go up it. Amazing group of people sort of saw us off at Lechlade, but then you are literally through the countryside for a good 70, 80 miles before you start hitting the sort of bigger conurbations of places like Oxford and Reading and Oxford and Marlow and Henley and those type of places. But it was something else. I mean, on average, we're sort of in the water for about 14 hours a day. I mean, it takes its toll, really takes its toll. And it took its toll on David. If you haven't seen the documentary, definitely worth a watch, particularly on day 3 as we came into Abingdon, when David was diarrhea and vomiting, and he was in a really bad way. Well, I pushed him in the water the following day. But tough. I mean, a tough challenge all round, really tough.
Yeah, and everybody watching it completely agrees. I'm an experienced open water swimmer, but there is a limit even for me. And it's even well before getting in the Thames is my limit. If it's under 20 degrees, I'm sitting there going, that's probably a bit cold, but that's just me. So that's certainly a challenge that people can relate to. Obviously, an extreme end. So I just want to bring it back and go, okay, you've been through this, you've helped people, you've done it yourself. What are your number one tip, maybe even top 3 tips to help people set a challenge, start that journey, and then achieve it? Whether that's a short-term challenge, whether it's a long-term challenge, what are your top tips for people?
Wow. I think top tip number 1 is enter.
Yep.
I think it's the first stumbling block. I think it's one of those things that we, it's very easy to talk about doing a big challenge. But that rhetoric never delivers success unless actually you enter the challenge itself. So I think, the first thing to do is actually enter. And by entering, I mean, obviously some of these challenges that, some of the challenges I do aren't necessarily organized events. I think by entering, what I mean is tell everybody you're doing it. So tell everybody you know that you are taking on this challenge. Now, that's a really scary thing to do, but I tell you what, it does create a fabulous motivation, because now everybody knows you're taking on this challenge. And the interesting thing is that invariably people you haven't seen for a little while, so how's training going for the challenge that you're taking on? And so therefore what that does of a morning, when you wake up in the morning, you think, I can't be bothered. Actually, in the back of your mind, you think, gosh, someone's bound to ask me today how the training session went. And that sort of runs into a second but sort of similar tip. And I think that is that, what I often do, what we do in our house, is what we'll often do is put the training program in a public place. So on the fridge or on a cupboard door. And then with each of the training sessions, you tick it off. And it's actually a really wonderfully motivating process, because what you get satisfaction of ticking these things off. You deliver your own success by saying a bit session done, fantastic. But also people who, the family in the house, and then people who visit the house look at it, and they will look at it and say, wow, my God, how much training you're doing. Look at that session there. That looks brutal. And all of a sudden that sort of builds that confidence that you're doing the right thing. So I think entering and making sure you tell everybody, I think is a really important part of success in that challenge. I think the next real tip is I coined these little sort of phrases, but success is not a chance event. It's not just going to happen by osmosis. You have to plan it. And I think that planning process is really, really important, because what it does is, as well as setting things like the goals, which are crucial to that, it's actually planning the training that's required. It's making sure that you bring together a team, so you get the right people working with you. And having identified that team, it's also important that you bring the team together and make sure the team can operate successfully, not only with you, but actually together, because fractions, and it's interesting on some of the challenges we've had, the fractious nature of teams working together can really have an impact on the challenger. So making sure the team operates successfully. And I think outside that, perhaps the third tip is probably less of a tip, but more of a sort of a psychology, and that is it will come to an end, and I think often, to me, we often talk about motivation. Motivation is really important. To some extent, the first quarter is relatively simple. You've done all this training, everyone's excited, away you go. The final quarter, albeit you're incredibly fatigued, is easier, because actually you're close to the finish. You can see the finish. You can taste that success. It's the middle section where it's really, really tough. That's where it gets really tough, because it's at that point you think, can I keep going? How much further to go? Am I going to make it to the finish? All of those things. And I think it's at that point where the important thing in the back of your mind is just keep telling yourself, you will finish, and it will finish. And it is, whatever the modality is, one foot in front of the other. It's one arm stroke in front of the other. It's one turn of the pedal after another. And instead of thinking about the enormity of the challenge, just think about the present. Think about the next 5 minutes. Think about the next mile, the next 10K, whatever it is. But dissect it down into shorter, more manageable goals. And from a motivation, from a psychological perspective, it just seems that much more achievable. So keep going, because you will get there.
Yeah, and this is something I can relate to as a competing athlete myself. I race over a shorter distance triathlon than most people would generally like to take as a challenge, for example. And although I love every single minute of it, because that's why I get up at 6 o'clock every morning to go swimming and running and cycling, there is points in those races where, the gas is on. I'm up against some of the best athletes in the country of my age. We're sort of going hell for leather around this racetrack. And I go, do you know what? This isn't easy, because nothing good ever comes easy, but it is going to finish. I've just got to get through this next bit of this next lap on the bike, this next lap of the run, chase down that person. Don't let the person behind me chase me, but then it will finish. And, that's kind of become quite a constant mantra for me when I'm competing. And it's something that I speak to a lot of people who are looking to get into triathlon, or looking to just sort of do some physical activity a little bit more often than normal. It's just it's fun at the end of the day, but it will be hard, but it will end. And it's just sort of constantly reinforcing in the back of your mind, one foot in front of the other. Make sure that it's their feet, not in front of mine in particular. I'm very, very competitive, which I guess is another motivator again. It's not always about achieving something necessarily just for the achievement's sake. I'm pushing myself for myself. Sometimes there's an element of that competitiveness that will drive you. It's obviously not our 100% recommendation for your 100% source of motivation, but it's fuel to the fire that every day you can kind of build in that competitiveness that reinforces that drive to succeed and sort of push yourself to be better.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that. I mean, I've got 3 young children, and they'll roll their eyes as I say this to you, because I say it to them. But it's something I absolutely believe in, and I always, whatever they're doing, they obviously do plenty of sport and all sorts of other stuff. And the one thing I always say to them is, look, there's only one thing that you have to do, and that is give it 100%, and that is all you can do. And I think, my worry, particularly when I watch elite sport nowadays, I think, there is that sense that unless you win the gold medal, you have failed. And I think we have to be very careful about that psyche, because what you then start to do is you start to lose people from sport, because not everybody can win a gold medal. But there is one thing that everybody can do, and that is they can give it 100%. And certainly my, personally, what I'd like to think is whenever I cross the finish line, whether it's a major ultra endurance challenge or whether it's a race, is that I as soon as I've crossed that finish line, I reflect on it and think, did I give it everything I've got? And if I did, whether I'm first or whether I'm last is irrelevant, because it was everything I had on that day. And so therefore there's nothing else I could have done. And so I think, to my mind, just give it 100% and you will always achieve success. Yeah,
and success achievement is entirely individual, and that's the most important thing, isn't it? It's about identifying what you want to do, and in doing that, what's that going to then mean to you? What's that going to add to your life, to that journey? So that has been an absolutely fantastic chat. Thank you very much, Greg. I think there's going to be a lot of really, really useful tips for people there, especially around sort of finding that motivation and finding trusted people to help drive that to sort of that point of success, and success being different for everybody. So cool. Thank you very much. We will be back very soon for another episode, another slightly different episode of the Prof Talks, where we put more and more questions, more and more topics of conversation, where we're going to sort of help you to achieve your best, achieve the impossible, with the help of one of the world's leading experts, if not the world's leading expert in all things sort of endurance and physical challenge. So thank you very much, Greg. We will see you very, very soon.
Absolute pleasure. Take care.